Sorry, that took me slightly longer to walk across and pour some water than I anticipated. Sorry, my name's Robert Houghton. I'm down here from the University of Winchester, where I'm a lecturer in early medieval history. My angle into computer games and history comes through, I've done some research consultancy, particularly with Crusader Kings 2. It's that sort of game I'm most experienced with. I'm also an editor on the games column of thepublicmedievalist.com. If you're interested in writing anything for us, then please get in touch with me at some point. Today, though, I'm talking about computer games. And computer games, as has been mentioned a couple of times during this session, in fact, they're traditionally seen as this facile, colourful toy for children. Conveniently, that's changed substantially over the last 3 decades. 3 decades, it's incredible. As we've seen a growing number of serious games, games that deal with important political, philosophical, or historical issues, games that tell stories in new and innovative ways, and indeed we saw a number of those in earlier sessions. It's been great. Thank you very much to the organisers for having me and for running this thing. And as we've seen, games have been increasingly used in education and increasingly used within history education, whether it's to introduce students to broad themes within history or to introduce them to particular topics, to particular types of dysentery. And this has all coincided with a tighter connection between academic history and history in games. A growing number of studios have academic historians on their payroll, or at least use them as research consultants. The thing is, though, this interaction is typically very one-way. While we've seen a lot of academic history being used to support games, we very rarely see it going the opposite way around. We very rarely see history in games being used as a method to support historical research. There have been a few authors who put some ideas forth about this, and I've just got possibly the 3 most important articles. There are numerous others out there. I'm going to make a broad, sweeping statement because I'm acutely aware this is a very short slot. By and large, these historians, when they've been talking about creating games, they've been looking at them as research outputs, the equivalent of a monograph or an article. They've not really been looking at the games on their own terms. And a lot of these authors, they've been looking at how they can make games more like monographs. And in doing so, they've stripped a lot of the functionality out of the games. So can we do better? Can we do more? I'm going to spend the next 11 minutes making a case that we can. And in order to do this, I'm going to do 2 things. I'm first of all very briefly going to go through the nature of games. What sets them apart from other types of media? This is something that I know many of you are more acutely aware of, more well-versed in than I am, but please humour me, because it will all fit together when I come on to the second part of the presentation and talk about games as research tools, as research outputs, and as research processes. So first of all, what makes games different? I mean, stock images from Shutterstock, for one thing. There are many ways, games are different from other media. There are many different ways in this is the case, but fundamentally and most importantly for what I have to say today, it's their interactivity. Games are interactive to an extent unseen within any other form of media. They require player input to drive the story forward and ultimately for it to reach its conclusion. And this has 2 important consequences. First of all, it means that games have to present coherent worlds. There'll be abstract worlds, they'll be limited in size and scope, they'll be simplified, but they'll be internally coherent. Taking an action will, if not, well, it will have similar consequences no matter where you do it. Again, this is different from other forms of media, where if you're wanting to paper over some holes in your world, that's absolutely fine. You just dump a couple of dozen pages of purple prose, and you're away. The second consequence of this interactivity is that games are living documents. While designers can certainly have a huge amount of say in where the story is going within a game, Players always have a role to play. In many ways, they can act as co-authors within games. And what this means is when we talk about games, we need to look at them in a different way from other media. And this has been brought up before, so conveniently I can save myself some time and just run through it fairly quickly. I'm leaning heavily on Espinasseff's game world, game rules, gameplay. I'm using it in a slightly different way from before, but this will do nicely. So we have the game world, the characters, the locations, the landscapes, the equipment, the peoples who populate your game. We have the game rules or game mechanics, the things that sit behind the game world that allow it to function. Whether it's how combat works, how the economics work, what will happen if you populate your village with werewolves, or increasingly what drives social interactions. And finally, we've got gameplay. This is what the players do with the game. So at its most basic, how they work their way through the game, how they ultimately win. But beyond that, it's speed runs, stealth runs, it's how they interact with other players, forming guilds or great building projects. And this extends outside the game. It's how players interact in forums, and ultimately how they create user modifications. Okay, fine, mods. So, that's a brief outline of how I see games. How can we use this to support historical research? How can we move beyond the really important educational work that's been highlighted? And how can we use it beyond the classroom? Well, first of all, I want to go into what is historical research. And conveniently, historical research basically has three components. I think everyone can see what's coming here. Oh, I've lost a bit of text. Never mind. So, essentially, as a historian, I do three things. I collate data and I present it. I go through all these primary sources, I look up bits of information, I try to figure out what exactly is happening within these documents. I then go on, I conduct analysis. I look at the information and sort of try to figure out patterns within it, try to construct something coherent. And finally, I engage with the analysis conducted by other historians. Historiography, if you're feeling fancy. And these map very neatly onto the three elements of games. The game world is very well suited to presenting data, whether it's piles of statistics or complex relationship networks, or even just what a cathedral looked like back in the 11th century. The game rules and mechanics are very useful for presenting analysis. Any mechanisms within historical games are inherently a piece of historical analysis. It's an explanation for how the world worked, or how part of the world worked. And finally, gameplay can facilitate debate. It can allow this analysis to be interrogated. Through the action of play, it's very easy to pick apart the analysis represented by the rules and mechanics. You can find shortcomings within it. And ultimately, players are able to put forward their own counter-arguments, create their own analysis. And to illustrate this, I'm going to go to a pseudo-historical game. This is Mountain Blade. It's a bit of a hybrid game. There are strategy elements, role-playing elements, but ultimately, the core of the game for many of its players is the combat. This is what its big selling point was. And to this end, the designers have created a vast library of equipment, armor, weapons, shields, all the things you need to beat the living snot out of your opponents in this pseudo 14th century world. And all these items, they have an image attached to them. They have details like their weight, their dimensions. It's pseudo-historical, but for our purposes, it's still a wall of semi-historical data. And this data is fed into a system of combat mechanics. There's some of the standard bits and pieces here, so characters with higher strength will tend to do more damage, characters with higher agility move faster, this sort of thing. But what's interesting with Mount & Blade is there's a rudimentary physics engine in there, which determines the effectiveness of combat. Essentially, the faster a weapon is moving relative to its target, the more damage it will do, which means that if you charge an opponent, you'll cause more damage than if you're standing still. And if you're on horseback with a lance, you can potentially one-shot more or less anything you'll encounter. And this creates an emergent argument. It suggests that cavalry charges, and particularly heavy cavalry charges, are immensely effective. And this ties in with some commonly held theories about combat in the later Middle Ages. Charges by knights were hugely effective unless you had a good means to counter them. It's entirely possible this came out as a complete accident through the game, but it just about works. It's coherent within the mechanics and the data set. But it doesn't end there, because there's a problem with this system. And this was raised repeatedly on the various forums attached to the game. Knights were too powerful. If you're a halfway competent player, you get a band of maybe 20 or so knights and just run around the battlefield perpetually, just whittling down the enemy army. And there were two main reasons why knights were so powerful. First of all, there was no concept of fatigue. You could keep charging everywhere all day, and nothing bad would happen. And secondly, there were some artificial intelligence limitations. The computer was not very good at dealing with heavy cavalry charges. So through these forums, the players critiqued the mechanics. They interrogated the historical analysis. And then, several of them went on to create their own counter-arguments through mods. So a couple of examples here. Brittenwalder introduced it was a complete conversion mod for the game, but for our purposes, most importantly, it introduced the concept of fatigue. If you're running around too much, you become less effective. And the imaginatively named Formations and AI mod improved the computer command of its troops. It allowed it to better counter heavy cavalry charges. Now, obviously, all of this has been done on an informal basis. I suspect the vast majority of people involved in the creation of this game and the creation of these mods don't really have that much of an academic background. But that's not the point. This demonstrates that the process is there, it's viable. We can do all of these three elements of historical study within existing games. So, just to wrap up then, I've got 4 points. First of all, I need to emphasise, because this is going out online and so forth, I'm not for a second suggesting that games are a replacement for traditional research. Please do not send me hate mail about how I've set fire to the monograph and I will never be employed again. Games can't do that. They can't be monographs, they can't be articles, they shouldn't even try. They're a very different media format. Furthermore, there are numerous practical problems with using games as research tools, as outputs, and as processes. There's the question of expense. There's the fact that it's a very different skill set to make a successful game from doing history. But it's worth noting that games do provide an important new tool. They let us look at history in a different way. They let us engage with it. And ultimately, we've kind of been doing this wrong a lot of the time. We've had a tendency to view games as outputs, as the end point of historical work, when in fact, it's not the end point, it's the middle, it's the process, it's what allows further discussion of history. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Robert, for this very thought-provoking presentation. Any questions in particular before I call everybody to the floor? Yeah. Yes, nice.
Excellent. Thank you for your talk. Thank you for, nice shout out to Winchester, my home stomping ground. Yeah, I think we've seen it before when we've been making games for clients as well, for serious games as well, that it seems like the process of making them, particularly when you're kind of on that border of simulation, is actually probably more informative than the final result. As you say, the final result of a simulation is very good for promoting conversation, but actually trying to build the system's dynamic model, the how do we make this seem to be like the real world? Actually, that's where real understanding happens. So have you done any work in trying to get your students to mod as a process of learning about history?
Kind of.
Excellent.
But basically, I run a module called Middle Ages and Computer Games, my programming skills are not great. We will, in fact, it'll be running next week. In fact, we have a games night where we use board games to look at mechanics, look at play, and we start off with a very basic and very bad board game which I've thrown together. We played through it a couple of times. It deals with the fall of the Roman Empire. It's ridiculously simple. It's facile, basically. But then the students will come back in and I'll say, so, okay, how do you change this? How can we modify it? So there's the idea in there. I just don't have the wherewithal, I don't have the skills or the resources, to be honest, to do it with games. But ultimately, I'd love to do that. I'd love to hear any further thoughts you have about the viability of doing so.
I'd stick with board games for a moment. They're brilliant systems for learning about how systems work. They're really, really good. I spend time teaching workshops to digital games makers to help them simulate their systems in board games, to help them understand how things work. So I think that's a really, really good strategy. But we can talk about doing it digitally as well.
Thanks very much.
That's good, great, thanks.
Any other questions?
Nice.